I've just read your Place of the Lion, and it is to me one of the major literary events of my life, comparable to my first discovery of George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, or William Morris. This is Pints with Jack, Season 9, Episode 24. Charles Williams Month. Supernatural Stories. After Hours with Dr. Sørina Higgins and Stephen Keck.
Have you been looking everywhere, searching for a place where you belong? Away from the masses, among clinking glasses, where the hearth fire is on. Let the laughter welcome you in, that eagle and child din. There's room at this table, so take a seat and tuck right in. Pints with Jack. Pints with Jack.
Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. When talking about the Inklings, everyone thinks of Lewis and Tolkien, but fewer people then go on to think about Owen Barfield and Charles Williams. Well, listeners, we had an Owen Barfield month back in Season 4, and you join us today in Season 9, where we're getting to know Charles Williams. We began Charles Williams month last week talking to Greville Lindop about The Third Inkling, his biography of Williams, and today we're going to be taking a whistle-stop tour through the 7 novels of Charles Williams. And joining me today is not just one guest, but 2, Dr. Sørina Higgins and Stephen Keck. Dr. Sørina Higgins is a consulting editor, author, English teacher, and award-winning scholar of British modernist literature. Her academic work focuses on the Inklings, modernism, and magic. She's a consulting editor and writing coach through Wordward and host of the Words Do Things podcast. She previously edited an academic essay collection entitled The Inklings and King Arthur, and is currently writing The Oddest Inkling, an introduction to Charles Williams, due out from Apocryphal Press, hopefully sometime this year. She was first on Pints with Jack back in 2024 in a standalone episode about Charles Williams, and she was here again more recently for a Half Pint episode where we got to talk about the Ideas Worth Saving conference. And I'm also joined by Stephen Keck, who appeared on a Half Pint episode about a year ago with his sister Jodie. And Jodie and Stephen are co-hosts of the Good Stories podcast, a weekly show where they share their love of books and talking about a different book each week, which have included more than one Inklings-related book. Sørina, Stephen, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you, David. Glad to be back.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be asked to come back.
Sørina, what have you been up to since you were last on the show? Aside from, I do have to point out, teaching my mother about Narnia.
Which was a delightful experience, by the way. So I had this online course on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and David's mum joined, which was great. Well, what have I not been up to? I've been throwing all the darts at the board to see what will stick. I finished writing and recording an Inklings course for the teaching company for the Great Courses. I hope that will be out in June 2026. And then I took that Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe course, and I have it packaged for sale on my website. And I'm also about to teach a shorter version of it online through Politics and Prose Bookstore. My Word Hoard consulting business is still going on. I offer editorial services to writers at every stage of their writing process. And I'm starting to design some online writing courses as well, doing some YouTubing and that podcast that you mentioned. So as you say, doing all of the things.
And Stephen, as I mentioned in the introduction, you and your sister Jodie have covered quite a few Inklings-related books on your show. But I did want you to share with the people your favourite Lewis book, because it's not one of the usual ones you hear.
Well, like most Lewis readers, I do bounce back and forth, and so my favorite tends to change. But if I look at the one that I've gotten the most out of, that has shaped my view of the world and kind of opened my mind, The Discarded Image has always stuck with me, and I do really love it.
Well, that will probably be season 15 or 16 of this podcast, so I will be calling you back in to give me a shot in the arm as I try and tackle that.
I will cheerfully talk about it. I'm certainly not an expert on it, but I do love it.
Well, are you guys drinking anything today?
I am drinking a lovely rooibos tea, a red honeybush tea with some maple syrup and a drop of hazelnut.
Since it's afternoon here for Pints with Jack, I do have a pint of a 90-shilling amber ale from Odell Brewing Company in Colorado in my Good Stories podcast pint glass.
Beautiful. And since we're talking about supernatural thrillers this week, I decided that my drink had to be a spirit. in the end, I ended up choosing Suntory World Whiskey. It is called AO, spelled A-O, and it's Japanese for deep blue, which is a reference to the oceans which connect the 5 different countries whose whiskies make up this blend.
That's very thoughtful.
And today we're toasting Australian patron supporter Alex Corrie. So, Alex, may your day be both spiritual and thrilling. Cheers!
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 All right, so today, as I mentioned, we will be discussing the 7 novels of Charles Williams. And we're going to be addressing them in the order outlined in Sørina's Reader's Guide, which is on her blog, The Oddest Inkling. Obviously, there'll be a link in the show notes. And we're not going to go through each book in exactly the same level of detail for the simple reason that that would take much longer than an hour, and because I haven't read them all. So the goal of this episode is actually just to whet the appetite for people who haven't read Williams or haven't read much of Williams, and to give them some confidence and something of a framework for exploring his works. And so for each of the books, we're going to be asking, what's the central ritual object? What are the main spiritual forces that are invoked? What's the main conflict? And what are the main Christian and esoteric elements that are present? But before we get to that, what have been your respective histories with these books? Stephen, why don't you go first?
I first was introduced to Charles Williams when I was in college. I was a chemistry major, but my senior year, I took a C.S. Lewis and his Circle class. I didn't know you could actually make a living with that sort of thing, and I was delighted to rediscover literature. And in that class, I found Charles Williams. We read War in Heaven, and I remember I read the first half of it and enjoyed it, and then the second half, I felt whiplash and read it in a rush and realized that I truly loved it. And that was my one Charles book for many, many years. Well, then I started a few years back for my birthday. I got The Place of the Lion and Descent into Hell. And both of those were just groundbreaking and profound, but in strikingly different ways from the way War in Heaven was. And so at that point, I viewed myself as a Charles Williams fan and went out and grabbed another one, The Greater Trumps. That one made me deeply uncomfortable, and I began to wonder if I was a Charles Williams fan. And then I found Many Dimensions and loved it immensely and thought maybe I had misjudged The Greater Trumps. And then I read Shadows and Ecstasy and really wondered if I was a Charles Williams fan. And then I came across All Hallows Eve and found that I loved it and realized in looking back over the scope that even the ones that made me uncomfortable had some profound truth and some deep beauty to them. So yeah, again, passionate reader. I am now through his novels. I have not yet dived into a lot of his other stuff, but I've enjoyed the novels immensely.
That is pretty perfect.
That is a very amusing history, up and down and up and down.
Well, how about you, Sørina? You've obviously done a lot of Williams, but specifically his novels. Where did they come in for you?
Yeah, my story is surprisingly similar to yours, Stephen. I was a music major in undergraduate, and my favorite music professor said, if you like Tolkien and Lewis, you should try this guy Williams. And I said, ain't nobody got time for that. But then after I graduated, I picked up The Place of the Lion, and top of my head lifted off. Whew. Was totally perplexed. I read Thomas Howard's book that sort of simplifies and sanitizes the novels, and that helped me for a while. And then I read his Arthurian poetry and decided my life's work was to annotate that. Haven't done it yet, so hopefully that means I'm not ready to leave this world. There is plenty of work yet to do with commentary on his works and with dealing with that whiplash. I mean, I have gone through several phases of this man is extremely disturbing. His personal life was troubling. There's content to worry about. Should I keep reading and studying and working on his books? But I keep coming back to them, and we will probably discuss why.
Well, I did want to read a little bit from that reader's guide that I mentioned earlier, because you said, I think the novels may be the best place for anyone to begin simply because they are the easiest to read. That is not to suggest that Williams's novels are cheap page-turners. In the casual crowd of beach novels, they stand alone in a corner, dressed in black, mysteriously murmuring big words, smoking artistic cigarettes. But at least they have a fairly straightforward plot, which cannot be said for his other works. I think that's probably quite a good preparation for talking about these books. But I did want to ask you guys, what do you think is the best way to pitch Williams in general and his novels in particular when we're talking with friends and family?
That really must vary depending on our audience or the friends to whom we're speaking and what their interests and priorities are. But I think for me that one of the biggest appeals is how there's so much more to the world than meets the eye. So we go through our lives and we feel like the things that happen to us matter, right? we get married or we have a baby or we suffer a terrible loss, and we feel like that matters on some cosmic scale. In a reductive materialist view of the universe, we would be wrong. Those things wouldn't matter at all. They would be simple biochemical material events, or not even that. But in Williams's universe, those things do have cosmic importance, like literally cosmic importance, eternal significance all the way through the past and into the future and on into eternity, and cosmic significance across universes. The supernatural lurks everywhere. The paranormal could break in any time, and the heavenly touches the earthly at every corner. And I find that very profound and beautiful, and sometimes disturbing, but in a good way, a way that's a good challenge to think about.
What about you, Stephen?
For me, when people ask me about Charles Williams, I usually reference what got me into reading him later after I did the War in Heaven stuff. And it was actually the first thing were the letters of Tolkien. When you read through J.R.R. Tolkien's letters, during the war years, it is fascinating how often when he's writing to other people, he talks about these encounters where he went to have lunch with Lewis and Williams or with C.W. and it just, the love he had for him, how charmed he was by him, and how much he relied on those encounters to get him through really jumped out of the pages. After Charles Williams died, he wrote a letter to Charles Williams' wife, which again was just full of love. And after C.S. Lewis died, there's a letter that also references Williams, which talks about how he loved him and was part of their relationship, although kind of came a little between him and Jack. And so that made me wonder, who is this man that Tolkien loved, even though he didn't necessarily like his writings? And then you reach out into Lewis, and Lewis's letters and diaries and stuff share a very similar thing. Now, he loved his writings too, but he loved the man. And then most recently, as I was reading through, I think it was All Hallows Eve, T.S. Eliot wrote the introduction to that. And T.S. Eliot was this very similar, that he loved the man. He loved his writings, but as a man, he was incredible. And it made me wonder, who is this guy that all these giants and heroes of mine loved? And so I think when people I respect love something, it's worth taking a crack at it. And so that's how I kind of try and pitch Williams.
Oh, wow. That is so beautiful. Thank you, Stephen. I've been doing a lot of work recently to try to set the record straight that people say, oh, Tolkien didn't like Williams. He said, I never knew him. He was only Jack's friend, and even called him a witch doctor. But that was late in life after Tolkien read a biography of Williams and found out some of the less savory bits. And so he sort of retconned their friendship. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
And Tolkien definitely got salty as he got older in his letters. It comes
Absolutely.
out. But
he liked to play the curmudgeon.
Yeah.
J.R.R. Tolkien, he said some stuff.
While we're talking about the friendships with the Inklings, David, could I mention the meeting between Lewis and Williams? And
Absolutely.
Also set the record straight on that, too. There's another misconception that goes around is there's this story that's mistold saying that Lewis and Williams met when their fan letters crossed in the mail. And I keep coming across that story, and that is not true. That is incorrect. Lewis wrote Williams a fan letter, and then Williams responded and said, if you had delayed writing another 24 hours, our letters would have crossed in the mail. I believe that Williams was only being polite and never would have written said fan letter. He wasn't really in the habit of being a fan of other men's work. He was a little too fond of his own. In any case, they were each reading and appreciating each other's work at the same time.
I'm actually going to quote a little bit of that when we get to The Place of the Lion.
Oh, beautiful.
But yeah, it is funny how some of these things persist. And you do sometimes wonder their origin. At least this one you can sort of understand. But I remember when I read Ian Wilson and he was talking about Lewis failing his driving test in it 17 times or something like that. And I have no idea where he got that from, but I've seen it reproduced in more places than it should have.
As somebody who's guilty of perpetuating that stereotype and lie, it's an easy story to tell. I mean, on our podcast, when we did War in Heaven, I said that. And I think even at the time, I knew it wasn't true because I had read the letters. So I have no excuse or justification. Dr. Higgins, you are absolutely right.
You're just out here spreading falsehoods, Stephen.
That's what I do. But with enthusiasm.
If you're going to make a mistake, do it boldly.
Very true. That's a paraphrase of Luther, effectively, as well.
That's why we need us pedants around to be like, no, this tiny detail.
Yes, the well, actually crowd.
The well, actually.
But Stephen, what you were saying there, that is how I have started pitching Williams. because it was actually how I got into MacDonald, because I had seen MacDonald referenced in Surprised by Joy, seen Lewis rave about Fantasties, and I read it and was like, I don't get this at all. But it's also a work I've come back to again and again, and the more I've read of MacDonald, I'm now starting to see what it was that Lewis loved about it. And after reading more Williams now, there's something of a similar quality insofar as when Lewis described reading Fantasties, he spoke about the bright shadow of the book coming out into our world. And I think it's something like that with Williams as well, because of how he views everything connected, the spiritual and the physical. And my next question was actually going to be, are there any final words you'd offer to somebody before they dive into Williams? And the thing that I would just point out is that there are different kinds of fantasy. So you've got Narnia, which is like a portal. You go to that world. You have The Lord of the Rings, which is immersive. We start in Middle-earth, we end in Middle-earth, everything is there and the world is built. But you then got the more invasive kind of fantasy, and that's Williams, where you see the supernatural breaking through into our world, showing that it's much more connected than, even if we're believers, we so often fall into a more naturalistic thinking of, well, yeah, the natural stuff is here and the spiritual stuff is out there. The idea that the world is two stories. We've got the physical here and the spiritual up on the upper floor, but the two don't actually interact.
And I would add one more thing, if I may. Lewis wrote the introduction to On the Incarnation. And in it, he talked about how, as a teacher, he was always surprised how people tended to read books about books, but were scared or hesitant to get into the original book. And I think that applies to Williams because he is formidable. He is intimidating. And a lot of people have read articles and discussion on him and thought, am I really ready for this? And so I would quote C.S. Lewis on this. It has always been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that firsthand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than secondhand knowledge, but it is usually much easier and more delightful to acquire. So I would say hop into Williams. It's delightful to acquire the knowledge.
Oh, hear, hear. Yes. Who wouldn't rather read the novel than a work of literary criticism? Every sane person. I like the comparison to MacDonald. Lewis said that the quality he got from MacDonald was holiness. If we continue that parallel, perhaps the quality we get from Williams is glory. It's a bright, mazy glory, but not mazy in a foggy or vague or hazy sense, in a geometric sense, a complicated Celtic diagram. And to those people who, Stephen, have read one of those articles or books warning them against Williams's complexity, what I always say is just enjoy the sheer artistic beauty the first time through, especially the poetry. But this can be true for the novels as well, in their more visionary passages and in some of the more labyrinthine moments of the prose. There is stunning visual beauty in these novels. He describes these glorious tableaus that are just full of gold and bright colors and images set up as if to be in a painting or a photograph or on a stage. And he also has really impressive verbal beauties, aesthetic beauties of language. So perhaps on a first read through, readers don't need to say, oh, I have to be able to parse every sentence down into my own cold prose, but enjoy the pictures and the music and the actions that are happening. And you'll get enough of the plot to be going on with.
So, Sørina, in your reader's guide, you suggest the following order for Williams's novels: War in Heaven, Many Dimensions, The Place of the Lion, The Greater Trumps, Descent into Hell, All Hallows Eve, and Shadows of Ecstasy. Broadly speaking, why do you arrange them in this order?
This is my subjective evaluation of least difficult to most difficult, as far as comprehension and content.
Stephen, any alteration you'd make to this list? Any novels which you think you'd push closer to the top or closer to the bottom?
Not surprisingly, based on what I said earlier, I would push Greater Trumps down to just above Shadows of Ecstasy.
Yeah.
Oh, that difficult, huh? More than All Hallows Eve. Wow.
Yeah, for me, it was a struggle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, gotcha.
Well, our first book is War in Heaven, and since out of all the novels, it's got the closest thing to a plot, what are the main story beats, Stephen?
So they find a corpse at a London publishing house, And that's how it all starts, as a murder mystery. But then very quickly, a country priest, an archdeacon actually, is in the same publishing house, and he is allowed to read an unpublished excerpt that tells him that the Holy Grail has actually been found, or probably exists, in Fartles. Fartles, despite being an awesome name, is also the parish where this archdeacon presides. And he goes, and goes and finds it. It doesn't take long before other people start looking for the Grail, some for good purposes and some for bad purposes. And what you end up with are these multiple attacks on the Grail, until finally there is this cataclysmic conflict between the good and the bad sides, and it even includes the legendary Prester John.
Now, I gotta say, I loved this book. This one is so much fun. I mean, I grew up with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I was a little disappointed that Sean Connery didn't make it into this book, but it was just wonderful. And
I think you mean Harrison Ford.
Him too. I was always a huge Bond fan, so Sean Connery's got to get in there too. But I love the way it started, and it's also so very Inklingsy. Like for C.S. Lewis, his finale for the Ransom trilogy, that hideous strength, where does he begin? In a place that he knows. We're going to deal with university bureaucracy. Charles Williams works in a publishing house. Yep, we found a body. This is where we're going to begin. But as you said, Stephen, it doesn't stay there. We head off on an adventure pretty quickly.
I'm doing a series on YouTube right now of little mini lectures about War in Heaven. And the first one, or the second one, is talking about how he takes these two genres, the murder mystery and the quest for the Holy Grail, and smashes them together and says, what are they each going to do to the other? And gets something new as a result. It's also very funny. We often talk about Charles Williams and never mention that he has a great sense of humor. It's a particular sense of humor, kind of literary. Like, we have this depressed publishing clerk wandering through the rain, and he takes refuge in a barn or something, and he says, what was this bloody world created for? And lo and behold, this random duke, who happened to be also out walking, speaks from the darkness. What is it, like to glorify God and enjoy him forever? Alternatively, as a sewer for the stars. And so you just get these like really, really funny moments, and comments about, I didn't expect to find a body under my desk. And it's a very clever sense of humor. There's a lot of Dorothy L. Sayers going on in here. It compares a lot to her murder mysteries that also take place in sort of ordinary settings.
Yeah, and the question of, if you found a body underneath your desk, would you prefer that person to be dead or alive? Which would be more awkward?
Right. At first he thought he was doing something to the telephone lines, but then the murderer confesses on page 25, and so we say, where do we go from here?
That was a quick mystery. But we do find our central ritual object appearing very quickly, which in this case is the Holy Grail. So, Sørina, would you mind jumping us off from there as to the meaning of this artifact?
Sure. Each of his novels has a central ritual object, or sometimes person, and they serve as the catalyst to reveal to us each character's spiritual trajectory. So how the characters respond to, in this case, the Holy Grail, shows us whether they are moving closer to God or away from God, whether they are moving towards the submission of self to the divine, or whether they are moving towards worshiping themselves and trying to control the whole universe. So we see all these different characters reacting by wanting to possess it or destroy it or use it to destroy others, or merely letting it be and sort of basically saying Providence will have its way.
Stephen, what were your thoughts on this one?
I loved it deeply. Anytime you bring the Grail into a story, I'm happy. And I think they did it in a profound and winning way. The other thing about this, again, is the character of Prester John. I mean, the priest and king from history. And the way they work it in is phenomenal. And so this was one of those stories that I think about a lot. As you describe the way the characters interact with this object and their spiritual trajectories, there is a great deal to admire in this book. The Archdeacon is just an incredible character and somebody you can spend your life thinking about. But in this one particular, he also offers redemption in some very special ways. Not only the man murdered at the beginning, but even the villain, even the worst guy in the book, Gregory Persimmons, has a redemption arc that's actually somewhat believable. And I think he does a phenomenal job with it. So the grace of God really comes through in this in a striking and powerful way.
I agree. And the Archdeacon's name is Julian, Julian Davenant, and that is done on purpose to evoke the great mystic Julian of Norwich. And several of William's works have this character who is saintly, and they're saintly in a very specific way, which is they have totally submitted their will to the idea that everything that happens in love. Love is playing all the music of the universe, is choreographing all the dance moves of the universe. And so they accept everything with this deep tranquility. And Archdeacon Julian Davenant is one of those. He's one of the only male instances. They're usually women in the novels, which is interesting. And he's a delightful figure, yet he's not at all boring. Williams knew how to write goodness in a way that is fascinating. The Archdeacon has a snarky sense of humor. He likes to practice fencing. He's just a lovely fellow.
And he did actually put me in mind of the Green Lady in Perelandra, with the line where she speaks about accepting whatever wave Melildil sends.
That's right. Yep. And we shan't spoil the ending, right? But there's a lovely mapping onto the three main knights of the Holy Grail, Sir Bors, Sir Percival, and Sir Galahad. And there's sort of this transcendental ending that involves assumptions into ecstasy.
Is there anything you want to say about the Christian and esoteric elements that are present in this book?
Hell yeah. I'll take the esoteric if you want to take the Christian.
Yeah, I'd love to take the Christian, and I'll try and do this without spoiling the ending too much. But one of the things that I get out of basically all of Williams is the concept that the divine God can take care of himself. That it's not our job to defend God, that God's got this, but he allows us to participate in it, and he allows us to be a means of his grace. And that comes through so strikingly in this book. And the Grail, as many know, is usually considered the cup of Christ that his blood dropped in. And so there are obviously Eucharistic associations with this one, which are just deep and profound and wonderful. And this, to me, speaks to the concept of a sacrament. So sacramentality, I think, shines through in William's stuff. So if we're talking about Christian stuff, the Church of England has something called the 39 Articles. The 39 Articles help kind of delineate what they believe on certain things. The 25th article talks about sacrament, and it speaks about it as an external manifestation of an internal grace that God is doing. And I think we see that in this book. We have these external manifestations. We have the cup. We have the Eucharist. We have these things that are happening. But it's God who does it. It's the divine that actually wins the day here. And so I think we see in story form a fantastic explanation of sacramentality.
The whole idea of everything also being gift. And that's contrasted with the baddies of this story that want to take and use rather than offer themselves.
Exactly. And it's in the baddies that we see several instances of esotericism, but interestingly, we also see some of it in the good guys as well. There are specific elements of black magic performed by several of the villains. There's a kind of a solo black mass in which a character dedicates himself to the devil and says that he wants to sacrifice the soul of a child to his god, the devil. There's an incredibly creepy scene of a woman's dark enchantment that the villain puts an evil ointment on her, and she sort of goes into a possession trance and dances like a dervish, and it's a profoundly disturbing scene, and is meant to be. There are three sort of dark magicians who have a room where they practice their spells, and they draw evil signs on the floor, which actually suffice to kill one of the good characters, and they attempt to bind or marry a dead man's soul to the body of one of the living characters. So Williams doesn't hold back on using all of the trappings of Gothic horror and of weird fiction and of occult-inspired novels and mysteries of the time. But he also draws from the esoteric tradition that he himself practiced and believed in. His occult master was a man named Arthur Edward Waite, and Waite wrote a book about the secret tradition as found in Arthurian literature. So Waite believed that at the original Last Supper with Jesus and the disciples in the upper room, that Jesus performed a secret Eucharist And by that, he means the words, basically. There was a spoken liturgy that Jesus used that was never written down, but the disciples memorized it. And they passed it down to Joseph of Arimathea, who then passed it down to high adepts, to high-ranking initiates, one by one through the generations, all the way down to Arthur Edward Waite in the 20th century. And the Holy Grail there, as you said, Stephen, it's the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper, and in which his blood was caught on the cross and then appeared to Joseph of Arimathea. And the Grail is sort of the central kind of holding vessel of this secret tradition. So Williams studied, read, and practiced rituals related to this concept. So for him, the Grail is a central point of the passing of secret knowledge of Gnosticism down through the centuries and down to modern times.
And if people are interested in this esotericism, Sørina is going to be returning in 2 weeks, and we're going to dive deeper into that very, very weird world. But tempus fugit, so we're going to move on to the second book, which is Many Dimensions. Why is this a good follow-up to War in Heaven?
This one is fascinating because for most authors, they have a hero that is their connection from story to story. Williams doesn't do that. He uses a villain. So it's a name we didn't talk about in War in Heaven, but Sir Giles Tumulty is really a bad guy in War in Heaven, but he manages to kind of get out, though Prester John gives him a lecture. In this one, though, he is the driving force behind this story. And whereas in the first one, we deal with the Grail, this one deals with the Crown of Solomon.
And specifically, a stone from the Crown of Solomon, a little half-inch cube of something like perhaps white marble or porphyry or alabaster. And it has in it, but as part of its nature, the 4 letters of the name of God, the Tetragrammaton. And this magical object provides seemingly unlimited powers to its holder. If you are holding this stone, you can travel anywhere you like merely by visualizing it. You can travel when you like merely by thinking of that moment in time. It heals the sick, and it could provide unlimited wealth to its holder. Moreover, if you chop it in 2, the 2 have exactly the same volume, weight, and mass and density of the original, and the original is not reduced thereby, and every copy has all of the properties of the original. This produces some understandable concerns in the transportation authorities of the island of England, and looks fair to be overturning healthcare and all kinds of other infrastructure. But the travel in time is absolutely fascinating. I have a blog post where I examined the history of time loops in fiction, and there are all kinds of other candidates for first time loop in fiction, but I do believe that Williams is the very first author who did that exact thing where somebody wishes themselves into the past, but then when they live up to the moment when they did it, they again wish themselves and they're stuck forever in that loop. There are other slight variations on it that occur before Williams, but he does seem to be the first one to invent that strict time loop.
It kind of reminded me of the latter stages of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of people are getting too powerful. We need a way to limit this. So you have this incredibly powerful ritual artifact that has all of these powers. What is then the main conflict of the story?
I think it's exactly that this isn't limited. That this is something where there are no caps. I mean, imagine a world where everybody's got a genie, but with unlimited wishes. People can have whatever they want, good or bad. And what would that look like? And so a lot of the book is highlighting, some of these are funny and some of these are tragic. I mean, the first people to get their hands on it, really their goal with this thing that can do whatever they want is transportation. I mean, that's what they're going to do. They're going to sell it for transportation.
You don't know how bad it is in Britain. Our motorways are shocking.
But then you get others that discover these other powers, and then there becomes healings involved with it. And then you see how the wishes of one group impact the wishes of another group, how not everyone can have everything. And so what is, again, this is one of the many, many questions that comes out of this book, but it just left me reeling just thinking about this concept. What if we could have whatever we want? Essentially, this is whatever you want. And where does that go? And how do you deal with that? And then the way he wraps it up, I think, is really interesting and really clever. Again, we don't want to spoil everything, but the other name of the stone is the end of desire. And if you think through that concept of everybody can have whatever they desire, it starts to make sense where he goes with it.
And I really admire how, as a novelist, he lets things get out of hand. I would have wanted to control my narrative and just follow one or two themes or one or two characters, but he lets this get to be an absolute disaster all over the country, and he lets it get political and economic, and it's really, really messy. So then the central conflict, really, where our emotional and psychological energies are focused when we're reading, is on one particular character, and whether she is going to choose to use the stone for herself, or whether she is going to choose to submit herself and be used by the stone or the divine powers behind it.
And I mean, the Christian element to this, I mean, is partly the artifact itself. You know, it draws from a character from the Old Testament. But what else is explored there in terms of Christianity, as well as these esoteric elements of magic, for want of a better word?
One of the other striking Christian elements of this for me was the concept of unity and multiplicity. And again, every one of William's books is very different. Though the last one was the Grail and kind of Byzantine sort of deal, this one is actually more Islam. It's actually more Muslim. The artifact was stolen, sort of, from the Islamic nations. And so you get a lot of these very devout Muslim characters talking about the unity of God. But at the same time, you have an artifact which is infinitely divisible, that can be multiple and yet is always one. That is a multiplicity and always a unity. And I don't know how any Christian can look at this and not think of the Trinity.
And the Islamic context for that is also interesting, because Islam actually isn't without the problem of the one and the many, because they say Allah is one, but he also has 99 attributes. How do those attributes relate to the one is a big philosophical question that has happened throughout Islamic history.
Williams is exploring in this novel, I think, how he's going to interact with these esoteric elements. I think he might be going through a little bit of a change in his thoughts at this time. But one of the strongest ones is the doctrine of correspondence, which is the idea that whatever happens here on Earth and whatever systems and patterns we see in the material realm are mirrors of something in the noumenal realm, as above, so below. And it turns out that this stone is a correspondent to another one, a ring on Solomon's hand, and that they somehow are connected to the primal energy that created all things. There he gets into the Kabbalah, the modern occult appropriation of a Renaissance appropriation of a medieval Jewish mystical tradition. And there the idea is that there's this primal light or this primal energy called Ein Sof, the One, which may or may not be equivalent to God. And then from it emanate these 10 spheres that are further from God and closer to material reality as we go. And somehow this ring, this stone, this light is the primal creative energy shining through all things. And that's essentially why the stone, quote unquote, works the way it does.
And once again, I'm back in Marvel Cinematic Universe with the Infinity Stones. It's like Williams was way ahead of the time.
Mm-hmm. By tapping into very ancient traditions, although the traditions were not as old as they claimed to be.
Sure. Well, let's move on then to another of my favorites, The Place of the Lion. And Lewis fans are going to know about this chiefly because after reading it in 1939, as we mentioned, Lewis sent Williams a fan letter.
1936, sorry.
Oh, is it 36? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I stand corrected.
Well, actually...
Okay, 1936. And I quoted a larger portion of this letter last week, and I quoted a small extract at the beginning of this episode. And as we said, after receiving this letter from Lewis, Williams wrote back. He had just been working on what would later be called The Allegory of Love, because he worked at the Oxford University Press. And he replied saying this: "My dear Mr. Lewis, if you delayed writing another 24 hours, our letters would have crossed. It has never before happened to me to be admiring an author of the work while at the same time he was admiring me. My admiration for the staff work of the Omnipotence arises every day." And so The Place of the Lion effectively got Williams a spot on the Inklings, because he was invited over, they hung out, they became friends, and he eventually moved to Oxford because of the war. So if a book gets you into the Inklings, then there's got to be some good stuff there. So, Stephen, do you want to take a stab once again of talking about what happens in this book?
Yeah, trying not to give away too much, but the city in England, and there's a lioness that has escaped from a traveling show. Two men are walking along, and they don't see a lioness. What they see is a lion in full power and mane, and he seems to be attacking a man. This man, Mr. Berenger, ends up in a coma after this attack, and it turns out he was actually the leader of a circle that were studying something, history of thought. A young lady gets asked to present to them her researches, and during that, someone else sees a snake, a massive crowned snake. And what we have from there on out is basically one animal after another coming out, but not just animals, great animals, these primal powers. And then you have this ongoing work to basically restore the natural order as this divine world is crashing into the real world around us.
I really want to say Plato. It's all in Plato. What do they teach them in these schools?
What do they teach them in schools these days?
But there's more to just Plato going on here. So, yeah. Sørina, what is happening with all of these animals?
Turns out they are not only the Platonic archetypes breaking into the world and each absorbing into itself its types, they are also the 9 orders of angelicals, as laid out by Pseudo-Dionysius in some early Christian/esoteric documents. Well, here we come across a feature of 20th century occultism known as programmatic syncretism. The orders in which Williams studied and acted loved to take every different system of philosophy, every different religious thought, and layer them on top of each other. And I mean, like, literally draw diagrams in which they layered them on top of each other. So they would take the signs of the zodiac and layer them on top of the tarot cards, which they would put on top of the tree of life, and so forth. So we see Williams doing that here with Platonism and Neoplatonism, and essentially saying in story form, these guys were onto the same thing. These guys were onto the idea that there are primal, archetypal, or elemental forces, which might be persons, right, like elemental beings, as we see in That Hideous Strength, or might be more abstract forces. They're not malevolent to humans, they just sort of accidentally swallow us up and destroy us as a side effect of their nature. So the whole world is kind of getting sucked into their vortices as the novel goes on. And one man has to stand up and save the world.
Stephen, what do you make of this?
There were a few things about this one that jumped out at me. First, this is one of the only novels I've ever encountered that seriously approaches the works of Peter Abelard. I mean, he sort of showed up in this one. And I've got to confess, my experience with Peter Abelard actually came through Mark Twain. If you've ever read The Innocents Abroad, he does not think highly of Peter Abelard. It's a great book and you should read it. But it's a little bit like getting your view of Arthur from reading his Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. It's probably not fair.
Oh, man. Not the most flattering portrait.
So that was interesting to me on this, getting into these concepts of, idealism, nominalism, conceptualism, universalism. And you can see why people can be intimidated by Williams, because all these things are a natural discussion point to come out of this. But here's the good news, friends. You don't need to know any of it. Just read the story. If you want to look up that other stuff, you can, and it's great, but you don't have to. The other thing that I get out of this one is I love the fictional work he pulls in, the De Angelis, and he puts a history around it where he's describing this stuff. I mean, I actually went and looked for it because I wondered if it existed. It turns out it doesn't. I don't think it does anyway. Does it, Dr. Higgins?
No, it doesn't. He's totally pulling a Tolkien here. I'm going to make up these sources and put them in my book.
Yeah.
Hey, there's good medieval precedent for that sort of thing.
But the thing that struck me most about this was the concept of right order. Again, if you kind of step out of the idea of the esoteric part of this, it is the idea that the universe has a structure and an order to it, and we have a part and a place in it. And then things go bad when that order gets disrupted. And this one leans heavily into kind of what is the idea of God's intention for man within that order. And so there is kind of a reclamation of the idea of the lordship of Adam, which is interesting. It's interesting to talk about and think about. So yeah, it was a fun book for me to read.
I do find it absolutely delightful. And there are some things in it that are just so human and so immediate, like the friendship between Antony and Quentin is this beautiful, beautiful, close brotherly friendship that I find admirable. There's also a portrait in it of this young woman who is a scholar who has made a kind of an idol out of her scholarship, and yet has done so while discounting any of the content of what she's studying. She's treating it all as a dry academic subject and not as something that might actually have immediate relevance or eternal meaning and eternal significance. So she has to be shaken out of it. And that's what shook C.S. Lewis when he first read it. He said, oh no, I was turning into Damaris, and you cut me off short from that path. There are also just the hints of one of the most important doctrines that Williams was developing at this point in his life, which is his romantic theology. He took this idea of the via negativa and the via affirmativa from the two Christian traditions, and he went down the affirmative route and said that we can get to know God through the beautiful things that God has given us, especially through girls. So, writing as a male author, he sort of put himself in that tradition of the poet who chooses a woman as muse and then uses his love for her as a rung on the ladder to God. And we start to see a little bit of a hint of that in the main love interest in this book, but it's done in such a unique way that it doesn't map onto what we think of as the love interest in a 21st century novel.
Well, since we still have 4 more books to go before the end of the episode, with the possible exception of Descent into Hell, let's
trot along.
Yeah, let's have a little less detail, and I think we'll need to talk a little bit more about Descent into Hell because that one's kind of important. But let's talk about the greater trumps. What's worth highlighting there?
Oh, I'm surprised that this is the one that you found so difficult again, Stephen, because I find this to be one of the most beautiful. And this is the one that did the opposite for me. When I was down in the dumps with Williams, it brought me back up again. Because here we have the most glorious visual beauty of maybe any of the novels, with the tarot cards and their lush colors and these golden dancing figurines that symbolize the great dance, like at the end of Paralandra, the great dance of all things. And there's one figure in this great dance who does not move, or at least those who are enlightened see it as not moving. And that's where T.S. Eliot got the still point of the turning world. That influenced him heavily. So the central ritual object is twofold. It's the original deck of tarot cards, and it's these little golden chess-like figurines. And if you bring the two of them together, you can control the movements of all things. And so the main conflict is one character trying to steal these tarot cards from another and loosing a terrifying snowstorm that threatens to devour the whole world, and the submitted saint going out into the snowstorm to rescue someone and living in the center of love as she does so, and practicing perfect tranquility and the peace that passes understanding.
Now, I haven't read this one. Stephen, looking back, is there anything that you could say to your past self that might have made this one less jarring?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think the thing that jarred me about it is that I wasn't really sure what the goal was. In these past ones, we've had kind of good guys and bad guys. We've had people with negative intentions, and we've had people with positive intentions, and then the story has been a working out of those things. In this one, there's not really a villain in the same way. The people that have the miniatures and who want the tarot decks, they don't strike me as villains. They don't strike me as bad people. And so, yes, if you could have them, you could have unlimited power, be able to see the future, unlimited wealth, but that doesn't seem like a goal that any of them really have. And so I'm not really sure that their motivation for pursuing this, I mean, up to killing with the cards, I'm not sure that he really pulled that off. The things about it, though, that are truly beautiful, I think goes back to the idea of a cosmic order. The idea that there is a dance, that there is a great scope that we all fit into. And again, the idea of submission. Submission and obedience has been a big part of his stories that we've talked about already. And it comes through very, very strongly in this one as well. Again, I'm not sure that the submission in this always comes through in the healthiest way, but I can see some things like that that are worthwhile. And then, of course, Sybil, the saintly character in this, is wonderful. She's beautiful and charming, and much like the Archdeacon, she's someone that I think you could think about a lot. I think what made me uncomfortable is she goes a little bit far towards accepting some of the Egyptian mythology and Isip worship. She draws her lines. And so, but some of these things I think are what made me uncomfortable about it the first time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And there is no one villain because even the would-be murderer, the whole point is that the character who is learning to love is essentially redeeming him through her love. And so all these characters that are really broken, really suffering, there's a good depiction of trauma, of loss. All of them are being brought back into love by means of love.
Well, let's move swiftly on then to number 5, which is Descent into Hell. And I've started dipping into this one. And I know that my co-host Matt was assigned to read Descent into Hell at university, but when I asked him what it was about, he couldn't remember a thing.
Shame, shame, shame.
Well, yes, I don't know. Our Matthew is sometimes he just likes to read likes to read the Cliff Notes. Who knows? But this is a work that I'd hoped to finish it before we recorded this, but it does seem to contain like the complete collection of all of Williams's key ideas, some of which we spoke about in the last episode, and we'll be speaking about the rest of this month. So where would you see those manifesting in Descent into Hell?
Yeah, that's right. He came into his powers in this time as a writer and as a guru, I dare say. He started his own order, the Companions of the Coherents, to practice his particular theology and practice. And those come through more clearly in this book than in many other places. It doesn't really have a central ritual object. The thing around which the characters revolve and what reveals their spiritual condition is a play that's being performed in this little country village. And each of them responds to the play in a way consistent with their trajectory. But we have a doppelganger, we have a woman who is both Lilith and Samael, who opens a hellmouth, we have a man giving birth to a succubus out of his own head and then satisfying his lusts with it. We have all kinds of magic, black and white and otherwise, throughout this book. We have a man who commits suicide, who is posthumously saved by someone else's substitution, and a martyr whose pain and fear are carried by someone else. It's just a glorious novel. And that list of things makes it sound like it's kind of a mishmash, but it's actually well crafted. It's actually more tightly crafted than some of his others. I don't know if you would agree, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, I love this one. This is one that I couldn't forget when I read it. Again, I was just kind of reading the books. I didn't know anything about Williams or his history or anything like that. But this story, the way he describes the idea of coherence it's the best way I think of understanding it is the way he describes it in this story. And then his description of hell and what hell really is has haunted me since I've read this book. This idea of a turning inside, of an inward dwelling, of a rejection of everything else around you is so profoundly and powerfully portrayed in this that you really just can't forget it. This is one of the recurring themes I see through Williams, this idea of interconnectedness. None of creation is alone. We all are connected to each other in various ways. And if we reject that, it's going to end very badly. And he describes it in just such a beautiful, beautiful way in this one. And then the other one on this one is, again, that scene with the redemption of the suicide, when the grandmother turns and says, "How tired you look." Just the empathy and the love in that statement. I mean, I cried when I read it the first time. And so this is one of those books that I will revisit over the course of my life because, again, whether I agree with aspects of it, that's a different question. But they are portrayed beautifully and definitely make you think.
Your description of hell and the turning inwards, that part reminded me of The Great Divorce. Yeah. When we did the season on The Great Divorce, we spoke about incurvatus in se, a line from Augustine, later repeated and emphasized by Luther, of a soul turning in on itself, and this being the greatest torment rather than something external.
And the image given here is of a man climbing down a rope, down, 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 hand over hand. But we get the idea that he's climbing down further inside himself somehow, further inside his own psyche, inside his self-chosen and self-made isolation. It's absolutely chilling.
There were a few references to the Tempest early on. Aside from the use of magic, what was he doing there?
He is asserting his literary greatness alongside a certain former playwright.
Oh, okay.
And he chose the name Peter Stanhope for the playwright in Descent into Hell. But Williams himself published plays under that name and actually attended rehearsals of one of his plays under the name Peter Stanhope. And the actors and so forth didn't know that Peter Stanhope was a pseudonym, a nom de plume for Charles Williams. But there is also this question of Williams coming to a turning point in his life where he's reevaluating his occultism. I disagree with scholars who say that he gave it up at this point. I don't think he's doing a Prospero, break my staff and drown my books. Instead, he's turning from the secret esoteric occult societies to his own public esoteric version, where he has this order that anyone can join, and its constitution, as it were, is the Bible. But it does have these ritual and mechanistic practices that are still magical at the bottom, and they are still based on the doctrine of correspondence.
Well, speaking of what other critics say, the next book, All Hallows Eve, is often said to be one of his best novels, if not his best. Do you think that's fair? Why do people even say that?
It's really profound. It's extremely well crafted. I think he's more a master of his syntax and his descriptions here than he is in some other places. It's not my favorite, but that might be more a matter of flavor than it is really of content. But it's extremely well done. He sort of takes all the ideas that he's been playing with all his life and brings them to maturity. So his concepts of this world and the other world impinging upon one another, he makes that literal. The book opens with a young woman trying to figure out what's happening. Within a couple pages, we realize she's dead. And she's here sort of still haunting London before she makes her final trip to the other side. And so she's able to exist in both worlds at once. And then later there is a literal sort of bodily passage from the other world to this world. And so he just takes these ideas and he elevates them. And the ritual object, instead of some sort of a MacGuffin from comics or murder mysteries or action novels, is a painting. And it's a profound work of art that is itself a reflection upon the making of art and the act of creation and how art can reveal spiritual conditions of those who make it and of those who look at it. And he matures his theology of romantic love as well into not just the early stages of a romance, but into a marriage of some years and then a marriage in which there's profound loss. And how do these characters still go on and love with their altered ideas of each other?
Mm-hmm. And what is the central conflict though in this book? Is it this person's journey between the worlds?
It's two interrelated ones centering on the magician figure, Simon Leclerc. First of all, he has made 2 copies of himself, and he's sent them around the world to conquer other continents. So there's sort of a big global conflict of whether Simon Leclerc will dominate the world. But that's really in the background to the local conflicts. So Simon Leclerc and his mistress have had a child on purpose to send her as a messenger into the other world. So there's a question of whether she will be saved and redeemed. There's another woman who is on a path to utter selfishness and utter inward turning. Will she be changed and redeemed or not? How will the main married couple deal with their lost and broken love? So I don't think there's really one driving conflict. I think it's these woven together in a complex tapestry.
Hmm. And what about the Christian elements that you see here, Stephen?
A lot of the same ones that he's used throughout the other books, but as you said, kind of elevated against some of the others. I agree this is not my favorite of his works, but it is beautiful. And in terms of like when you're just looking for a good story, I mean, this is like Twilight Zone at its best. I mean, it is incredibly well crafted and constructed, and you wonder what's going to happen with it. Simon Leclerc is a fantastic villain. But in terms of the Christian elements, I think for this one, the things that really struck me was one, again, that idea of submission and obedience to the will of God. Right. And to each other as basically manifestations of God as well. And so this idea of submission and obedience is a big part of it. And then the other one is, and this has been something I've seen in the others too, is this concept of kind of faith over learning. Simon Leclerc is an incredible example of somebody who is a master of learning. He has power and can utilize this power. But the people that defeat him and overcome it, they don't have any of this learning. They just have faith. either not always in God explicitly, but kind of through something else to God. And through that, he is overcome. I also enjoyed in this one, it's not really a Christian element, but this seems to be where he criticizes magicians a fair amount. Simon the clerk just isn't doing it right. There are several points where he says, you should have stopped here. A true adept would not have gone on once this happened. And then he talks about the idea that he consistently kept using lesser tools. He had this one tool and it didn't work. And so he went to a lesser tool. So obviously this is going to end wrong. And I caught a whiff of the professional evaluation on this guy, that this is how you do magic wrong was, I don't know.
Hear, hear. You're exactly right. And interestingly, that was a growing genre throughout the sort of the second quarter of the 20th century, was this growing genre of books by magicians about other magicians critiquing each other's magic. You have them by Yeats, you have them by Crowley, you have them by Somerset Maugham, you have all of these proliferating. And so I think here we have Williams commenting on the Black Magician gone wrong. Interestingly, the crux of the spiritual elements, and I use that word deliberately, is a moment when the Christian and the esoteric come together with great precision on a cross. So I probably don't have to explain to your audience the Christian imagery of someone on a cross, but one person decides that she will substitute herself for someone else. And the imagery is depicted as if she is bound on a cross, and the cross is reclining gradually in water. So we get a combination of crucifixion and baptism and flood imagery going on. But interestingly enough, Williams went through an extremely powerful initiation ritual. And he was one of the first people to go through it because his mentor, A.E. Waite, had just finished writing this ritual like a few days before, but modeled it on, adapted it from a Golden Dawn ritual that was very, very powerful. Everyone who went through this ritual remembered it for the rest of their lives. And you find it coming through in the writings of W.B. Yeats, of Aleister Crowley, Arthur Machen, Florence Farr. They all worked this ritual into their writings in one way or another because it impressed itself on their imaginations. So Williams went through this ritual in the early to mid 1920s. And it involved being bound to a cross and raised up on this cross, and then being brought down from the cross, garments changed into a white robe, and then brought into a tomb and seeing one's master lying in a coffin under an altar. And there were candles around, and there was ritual chanting and performances. And everyone who went through this ritual was deeply impacted by it. And so here we have the character enacting the being raised upon the cross of Tifereth, as it was called, when she decides to substitute for someone else. Now, A.E. Waite's order claimed to be a Christian mystical order, and he stripped off the Egyptian imagery and so forth and added in a lot more Christian imagery. Instead of doing a banishing pentagram, he did the sign of the cross and so forth. So here we have Williams stripping off that Egyptian imagery that you mentioned from the Greater Trumps, Stephen, and instead he has this cross image that, if we didn't know about Williams' occult involvement, we would think was just a straight biblical and Christian image. But in the syncretism that he practiced, it would have been the same. It would have been the image of Christ on the cross, the image of the founder of Rosicrucianism, Christian Rosenkreutz, in his tomb, and the image of every soul of an initiate trying to rise its way up the grades towards enlightenment.
Dang, that one sounds interesting.
It is.
Yeah, it is definitely interesting.
We didn't even talk about the little character he makes that's inhabited by two women's souls. And I mean, it's pretty impressive.
Golem, it is so creepy. It's just so creepy.
Well,
unforgettable.
At least from what I've read about it, we have perhaps saved the weirdest to last, which is Shadows of Ecstasy.
We can skip this one. No, not really. We'll touch on it quickly, right?
Yeah.
What do you think needs to be said? Any thoughts or health warnings about this book?
So it's the first novel he wrote, but it wasn't published until later. So in a way, it's misleading to leave it to last. Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
No, that's really good to know. That actually helped me to know that, because this one, again, I will say this one made me the most uncomfortable out of all of his books. There is a character in this who is obviously a high-level magician who is out to basically cheat death, to overcome death and come back from the dead. And what made me most uncomfortable is he's very clearly a villain in the book. He does awful things. And when he dies at the end, there's almost this wistful, we hope he comes back. So I couldn't really, I did not like the way Charles Williams approached that. Now, there was a single passage in this book, though, that will stick with me that I thought was striking and beautiful. There is an African king who has been enslaved by magic, by witchcraft his entire life. And there is a very simple, very good priest who says, I got this. And he takes him, kidnaps him, and through the power of the Eucharist, this Christian is saved from this magical enslavement. And so even in this book that I didn't really like very much, there are still scenes of striking beauty and things that I think that a Christian can read and not be uncomfortable with. But there's a lot in here that I struggled with.
Yeah, it's a very challenging novel to read from our perspective because of the racial dynamics, among other things. But Williams is doing something fascinating. He's turning European and specifically British imperialism on its head. He's saying what would happen if African armies came and conquered England and turned our culture upside down. So even though he does it with word choices that we don't like right now, the premise is a really interesting one, and I think a question that is worth asking. But you're absolutely right. The quote unquote villain is so charismatic and so appealing that many of the good characters who seem to be the morally centering characters are drawn to him. And so it leaves us with this profound ambiguity about whether or not we are supposed to approve of this guru and maybe try to practice his transmutation of energies into eternal earthly life.
I would argue no.
Oh, okay.
From your description there, it did sound like a mixture of Harry Potter with Voldemort and Black Panther and the Wakandans try and take over the rest of the world. Yeah, I might skip this one.
Fu Manchu in there as well. But it is fascinating to read these two back to back, All Hallows Eve and Shadows of Ecstasy, because we see Williams's first magician character and his last magician character, Simon Leclerc. Not quite his last magician character. You should also read his play, Terror of Light, in which he has Simon Magus from the New Testament appear. And there, the play is much clearer in overturning the Kabbalah and the magical practices and instead saying, like, let me give you some gospel.
Well, I'm sure we'll be returning to both these books and his plays in some future episode. But as we begin to wrap this up, I have a question, and this is always my question whenever I read a book. Do you think this could be adapted? Could this be turned into a play or a movie? Do you think any of the books that we've described, that could actually be done?
I am in contact right now with a scriptwriter who is adapting War in Heaven.
Oh my goodness.
For the screen. So here's hoping that he will be able to pursue that and see it come to fruition. But I would probably go with The Greater Trumps because it's so visually stunning. It has a small cast and very few limited set pieces, which would make it simpler to film. You wouldn't have to do a cast of thousands and filming on location all over the world. You could pour your resources into the magical imagery and the visionary and supernatural elements. But honestly, I could see any of these being made into a very powerful film and also absolutely trashed in the process.
How about you, Stephen? What would you try and change?
Yeah, War in Heaven is the one I would love to see.
Yeah.
I thought exactly the same thing. And, you could still have a cameo from Harrison Ford in there, just like tucked away.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. He's still doing that sort of thing.
Maybe like helping in the liturgy that they celebrate with the Grail. Just have him be a verger or something else just tucked away. That would just be perfect.
One of the police officers that turns up and gets turned away by the butler, something like that.
Well, we got to the end. Any concluding thoughts on Williams's books, how to read them, or just advice for people who are just embarking on that journey?
Just enjoy them. Just enjoy the exciting action of the stories and the beautiful scenes and some of the memorable moments and characters and lines and so forth. We probably haven't talked enough on this episode about his doctrine of coinherence, which is the idea of one person substituting themselves for someone else or carrying someone else's burdens. So a thoughtful reader might be interested in watching that concept evolve over the novels until it reaches its mastery in Descent into Hell and then becomes more subtle in All Hallows Eve. But whether one is into just exciting novels for fun or thoughtful ways of expressing Christian doctrine in fiction or creepy and bizarre esoteric ideas in fiction, hey, you got all of those here as options.
Yeah, I would echo, enjoy the weirdness. It just let it flow over you. And don't... Again, I don't think it's necessary that you have to agree with everything either in the stories or of the man himself. I certainly don't. But his works are beautiful. Both Tolkien and Lewis would often complain about people that cared more about the author than the actual work they wrote. Enjoy the works and have fun with it.
Hear, hear.
And I think my closing thought would be the reason that I've gone to people like Williams and Barfield and MacDonald in the first place is because authors who I loved them and their works. And so however you choose to sift through these things, I think there's something really instructive about looking at the things that the people you love, because they definitely saw something in there, even if it's not quite to your taste, even if it's only a particular portion of what they've produced. Lewis would talk about somebody's wonderful writing. So the philosophy that they're expressing is awful and terrible. But I really like the way they turn a phrase. That there is gold here in Williams for anybody that likes Jack. And if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you probably do.
And I find these novels spiritually challenging. Every time I read them, I feel myself being prodded and inspired to submit my will more to the will of God and to live in the heart of love and to live out of love towards others.
Well, as we wrap up, where can listeners go to find out more about you both? Stephen, why don't you kick us off?
Good Stories Podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify, any place you find podcasts. And then our email is goodstoriespodcast@gmail.com. That's goodstoriespodcast@gmail.com. I think we're on Facebook. I'm not a social media guy, but my sister is awesome. Jody's great. You'll love talking with her. So, yeah.
And Sørina, of you and your many adventures.
Oh dear, I'm all over the internet. So you can find me at SørinaHiggins.com or my editorial consulting at wordhoard.com. That's WYRDHOARD. And I'm on all the social medias and YouTube as Dr. Sørina Higgins.
Wonderful. Well, I hear the call for final drinks. So thanks to both my guests, Sørina and Stephen, for joining us today and getting through all of the novels of Charles Williams. That's got to be some kind of record. I'd also like to thank our stenographer, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, our patron supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters, Jacob, Alex, John, Ryan, Dan, Jody, Dave, Brian, Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, Paul, Bud, James, Robert, Mark, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Paul, Gary, Stephen, John, James, Kate, Peter, Rowdy, David, and Angela. And, of course, to all of you for listening. We pray for all of our listeners every single time we release an episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, maybe try picking up a Charles Williams novel. In next week's episode, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Paul Fittis, and we're going to be focusing more on the friendship between Lewis and Williams, as well as the relationship between their respective theologies. And we're going to add something to our usual sign-off today. In Middle English romance and law, to put oneself under another's mercy meant to yield oneself without conditions, abandoning claims of self-justification and accepting whatever judgment or pardon might be given. And while Williams didn't coin the phrase, he made "go under the mercy" a central phrase in his worldview, using it to express this voluntary surrender that we've spoken about in this episode, renunciation of self-justification, as well as his doctrines of exchange and substitution. And so we will be talking about that more in the coming weeks. And so please join us then when Charles Williams Month continues, when we'll continue going further up
And further in.
And until then, go under the mercy.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.